to a video on how to replace a BMW E90 evaporator and heater core. This is a fairly involved job because it requires removing a lot of the interior of the car to get at the heater AC box. But with the caveat that one always takes on any job at their own risk, this presents a fairly good DIY opportunity because you don't have to lift the car and get underneath it to do things, and it doesn't require a lot of special tools in order to complete the job. I don't have access to the factory workshop manuals, and the Bentley manual that I have doesn't really say much at all about doing evaporator and heater core replacement as far as I could see. So I searched YouTube and found 3 good videos that I was able to use in combination to complete this procedure, as well as figuring out things that I couldn't find in the videos. So the first one was Shop Life TV's video on removing the dash. They were removing other parts of the interior as well, and they didn't cover steering wheel removal and airbag removal in that video. But Auto Repair Guys, fortunately, covered the airbag removal. And a Milestone Motors video was excellent for learning how to remove the cage and reinstall the heater AC box, as well as removing the evaporator. So I strongly recommend checking out these 3 videos for additional information or another perspective. But if you want a one-stop shop for removing and replacing the evaporator and heater core, this video covers everything in detail, I hope. BMW used 2 suppliers for heater AC boxes for the E90, one from Vallejo and the other from Denso. The evaporator and heater core of these manufacturers are not interchangeable, so one has to make sure they get the correct one for their car. If you pull the climate control and radio out, which is actually quite easy to do as is shown in this video, you should be able to see the manufacturer of the box in your car so that you can order the correct parts before doing disassembly, rather than taking it all apart and then ordering like I did. The image below shows what you can see when the climate control panel and the radio are removed. You can see the sticker on the heater AC box back here. Here's a close-up of one of the stickers on my heater AC box, and as you can see, it indicates manufacturer, in my case, was Vallejo. While you're waiting for your parts to arrive, take your car to a local shop and have them recover any refrigerant that's remaining in the system prior to beginning the procedure. When you're ready to start the procedure, the first thing to do is place both the driver's and passenger seats all the way back. Next, disconnect the battery. Place something in the trunk lock to prevent it from allowing the trunk to close so you don't get accidentally locked out of the trunk. Open the hood and place service covers over the front fenders and remove the usual components required to get to the cowl so that you can remove the cowl. Next, remove the cap covering the bolt that holds the heater AC box to the firewall. It just pries off. Remove the T30 bolt that holds the heater AC housing to the firewall. Remove the bolt completely to prevent binding when putting the heater AC box back in place. Remove the 2 6mm Allen-headed bolts that hold the AC lines to the expansion valve. Undo the clip holding the small AC line to the firewall. As shown in this image, I have a trim removal tool or flathead screwdriver, and I'm simply prying up on the clip to open it up. I used a zip tie to hold this small AC line to the strut brace to help keep it out of the way. Next, remove the two T30 bolts that hold the expansion valve in place. And remove the expansion valve and set it aside. Then remove the half moon bracket from the lines. Next, we need to remove the hoses from the heater core, so use needle nose pliers to squeeze and pull back the hose clamp on the top hose. Carefully, so as not to puncture it, run a hook tool along the rim of the hose to help break it loose all the way around. Then pull the hose off. Some coolant will fall out of the heater core as shown in this image. Next, remove the hen coupling from the union for the lower heater hose and pull the hose off of the heater core. Remove the 13mm headed bolt on the firewall that's tucked behind the brake lines. It's necessary to push the brake lines toward the center of the car to get the large flange on the bolt to clear the brake lines. This is what the bolt looks like once removed. If you have access to compressed air, blow the remaining coolant out of the heater core so that it doesn't leak into the cabin when removing the heater AC housing. If you don't have access to compressed air, then you're going to have to find some way to catch the coolant as you fish the heater AC box out. Otherwise, it's going to spill on the carpet and make a mess. Now it's time to go into the cabin of the car and start removing the interior. Begin with the gear shift lever. To remove the gear shift lever, hold down the release button on the gear shift lever and lift straight up. Remove the leather shift boot by either gently pulling up on the leather itself or using a trim tool to pry it up. Disconnect the connectors from the bottom side. Start with the connector on the right side. Some people just pull apart this style of connector, but I like to use a small flathead screwdriver or small pick tool to lift on the side where the tab is, and then they pull apart easily. Then disconnect the connector for the gear indicator. Note that I'm illustrating here the flathead screwdriver, but I didn't use a large one like this. I use typically a very small flathead pocket-sized screwdriver, or even more commonly I used a 90-degree small pick tool. And set the boot with surround aside. Incidentally, this is also a good time if your trim isn't looking that great to disassemble this further, which is quite easy to do, although I didn't take pictures of it, and repaint the trim. Next, engage the emergency brake. Put the car into drive by pushing on the red clip with your finger and moving the gear selector. Raise the lid on the center console storage cubby so that it won't interfere with the trim removal. Now you can remove the trim from the center console. Start by lifting as shown in this image and as shown here, and the piece simply lifts right out. Release the trim with the leather around the base of the emergency brake. Remove the two plastic covers on the center console. This image shows the one on the left side. And here's the one on the right side. And then remove the 10mm headed bolts that were underneath those caps. Now go to the back seat and remove the rear console. Start by prying it apart with your fingers from the top. You will probably need to insert a trim tool on the lower right as I did, because it's a little bit stubborn here. And then the whole back piece simply pulls away. Rather than disconnecting the connector for the piece shown here, I simply remove the entire unit from the back of the console. Separate the connector coming from the bottom right side. There is a difficult to reach connector between the ducting. It will slide out of its holder so that it can be disconnected. Slide the connector on the left lower side out of its holder. And squeeze the tabs on the sides to disconnect it. Remove the wire from the relief in the console on the right side. Disconnect the connector on the left side. Remove the wire from the relief on the left side of the console. Then remove the two 10mm headed nuts from the bottom of the rear console. Slide the black connector under the emergency brake on the floor out of its holder so that it can be disconnected. This one is hard to get at. The images that follow show the connector and how it attaches to the console. The wire pictured here was also housed in the connector as shown here. With the console removed, it's possible to see where this connector attaches. So this is how the holder for the connector separates from the console. If you can get something like a pocket-sized screwdriver underneath it as shown here. Next, pull the emergency brake handle up as high as it will go. And in my case, I had to pull it higher than I ever pull it when I'm actually using it. And then you tuck the e-brake trim with leather boot inside the console because it stays attached to the e-brake lever. Now slide the center console up at the back and remove it from the car. It's a good idea at this point to take some images of how the wires, etc., were laying before you disturb anything. So this is what my car looked like. Next, remove the two T20 screws from the panel underneath the glove box. Unclip the wire for the footwell light. Unclip the wire for the auxiliary power outlet. And set the glove box under a tray aside. Remove the lower footwell side panel on the right side. It's necessary to remove these kick plates because the dash tucks into the top of them. You can see here how they just press in. So removal involves simply putting your hand around as shown in the previous image and pulling away. Next, remove the 3 T20 screws on the driver's side panel that's under the dashboard. Disconnect the black connector on the left side. Then disconnect the footwell light and speaker connectors. Remove the wire from the hold down on the panel and unclip the antenna unit from the panel. The panel should now be free so you can set it aside. Next, remove the lower left side footwell panel. Start by removing the Phillips screw from the hood release lever. Then remove the shorter Phillips screw that was under the hood release lever. Unseat where the footwell panel is tucked in with the door sill trim. Then pull the panel toward the center of the car. Disconnect the connector for the trunk button and set the panel aside. Next, remove the trim piece for the cup holders. Remove the cup holders by removing the 2 Phillips screws on each, then opening the respective cup holder and pulling out the cup holder by the extended part. Remove the 4 T20 screws on the top of the glove box opening and the 2 T20 screws on the sides of the glove box. Disconnect the connector for the glove box trunk valet switch. Disconnect the connector for the glove box light. Remove wiring from the holders on the glove box and set the glove box aside. Next, remove the large dash trim piece. Be careful not to pry on a corner to prevent cracking. There are 2 connectors that I didn't capture images of that need to be disconnected on this piece. First is the start button. You simply press on both sides and pull the connector out. For the hazard light switch / door lock / dynamic traction control buttons, there are 2 connectors that need to be disconnected, one small one and one larger one. Because of their location, I had to use needle nose pliers to gently pull the top larger one out. Next, pull out the climate control module starting at the bottom and working your way up. And you disconnect these 2 connectors. They have levers on them, and you simply press on the tab, thereby allowing the lever to pass over the tab and down all the way, which releases the connector. It's the same for both this white and black connector. Then set the climate control module aside. Next, remove the 2 Phillips screws holding in the radio. Slide the radio out. For the big connector, lift up the tab and push toward the back. And for the antenna cable, push the tab on the side and it will disconnect the cable. Now it's time to remove the airbag from the steering wheel. Caution! The car's battery must be disconnected for at least an hour before touching airbags. Use a flathead screwdriver to press the springs holding in the airbag. There are extremely well hidden reliefs in the material of the steering wheel where the screwdriver goes. Press in a bit on the airbag with the other hand while pressing on the spring with a screwdriver, and the airbag will release on that side. Then do the same on the other side. Next, very carefully, so as not to break the clip or wiring, lift up the tab on the connector. Usually one will start with one side and then lift up that side to get the other side unseated, and then lift up the other side. Once you have the tab lifted like this, then this connector will simply pull straight off. Then do the same for the other connector, and the airbag will be free. Disconnect the gray and black connectors in the steering wheel. And use either an impact gun or a breaker bar to break free the 16mm headed bolt holding on the steering wheel. Disconnect the blue connector in the steering wheel. Remove the wire for the blue connector from the hole down in the steering wheel. Note that there are alignment marks on the steering wheel and steering column so that the steering wheel can be reinstalled in the correct position. Pull the steering wheel off and set it aside. Next, pry off the cover for the key fob unit. Remove the two Phillips screws. There are two metal tabs on the right side that prevent the unit from pulling out because they catch on the dashboard. So I used a hook tool to depress the tabs so that they would be narrower than the dashboard, as illustrated in this image. Gently disconnect the ribbon cable by pushing in the two tabs on each side and then lifting up toward the roof. Before removing the holder for the climate control unit, take note of how the wiring is sitting for reinstallation. It's also a good idea to label all the wiring so that you know exactly where everything goes, as shown here. Remove the 4 T20 screws on the radio climate control holder. Then remove the two 8mm headed bolts on the inside. And set the radio climate control holder aside. Now it's time to remove the trim on the steering column. Caution: be very careful around the clock spring mechanism on the steering wheel. You do not want it to move because if it moves too much, it will break and is very expensive to replace. The first thing to do is adjust the steering column all the way down and out. Lift up on the top half of the steering column trim. The top half comes off easily. Then pull out on the tabs on both sides to release the bottom half from the steering column trim. Disconnect the connector for the heated steering wheel if your car is so equipped. And set the lower steering column trim aside. There are two connectors on the lower back side of the stock section, shown here. Disconnect both connectors. Now remove the 4 T25 screws. And gently pull out the stock section and set it aside. Next, remove the plastic cover from the fabric by using needle nose pliers to push the tabs together and out. They come out easily once you get the hang of it. Remove the 2 T10 screws in the gauge cluster. Use a finger to gently pry at the top to get the gauge cluster removal started. Then place the cluster in the 2 positions as shown in this image and the following image. Disconnect the connector on the back of the gauge cluster. And remove the wire from the hold down on the back of the unit. Next, remove the small piece of trim with the vent to the left of the steering column. To remove the light switch, pull from the top side and use a pry tool around the edges. Disconnect the connector on the back of the light switch. Next, pull the weather strip from the bottom up to the end of the A-pillar trim. Gently use a pick tool, and I tried plastic, but it wasn't stiff enough to work, so I had to use a steel one, to remove the airbag little plastic cover. And caution, we are now, and for the remainder of this job, working close to the windshield with tools, so it's crucial that nothing, no hard steel tool or part touches the inside of the glass, or it may very well crack. So always use small enough tools to minimize the contact area, and use your hand to protect the windshield from the tool. Remove the T20 screw and bracket. To remove the A-pillar trim, just pull out a very small amount to unseat it, and then slide upward to release the tab on the trim from the pin holding it in. If you try to pull it toward the center of the car to remove it, the tab will break. Here you can see the tab to which I'm referring, which slides over a pin in the A-pillar and down to secure it in place. Follow the same steps for the A-pillar trim on the other side of the car. Now remove the 5 T20 screws holding the dashboard in place. There's one on each end of the dash, 2 longer ones in the middle, and one on the lower left side. This is the orientation in which the screws go into the dashboard, and the 2 longer ones go in the center. Next, remove the defroster vent cover from the top side of the dashboard. Remove the 4 T20 screws holding down the plastic structure that sits below the defrost vent. Remember to be careful not to hit the windshield. And pull out the plastic piece. Next, we need to lift up on the solar sensor here from underneath to unseat it and be able to disconnect the connector. Note the orientation with which it sits in the dashboard for reinstallation. Then disconnect the connector. Remove the T20 in the middle back of the dashboard. Remove the 10mm bolt in the rightmost vent hole. A wire in the middle of the dashboard is connected to the dashboard with a Christmas tree style connector. That connector needs to be released from the dashboard, located here. This is its location looking from the underside. So you can press up on it, and I also used a trim removal tool from the top side to get it out. Slide the wire to the right side in behind the dash, unlike as shown in this picture, and let it dangle. Next, you need to crawl in head first into the passenger footwell and look up and remove the 2 connectors on the passenger airbag, just as you did with the steering wheel airbag. Now you should finally be able to gently wiggle the dashboard out and remove it from the car. Next, we need to remove the support cage. And before starting, take some pictures for reference of how everything looks when fully installed. Remove the 2 13mm headed nuts that hold the cage to the firewall on the right side. Release the ducting from the clip that holds it to the blower motor housing. Unclip the air ducting on the other end and remove it. Remove the wiring harness from the heater AC housing. There are 3 locations from which the harness needs to be unclipped from the housing. For reinstallation, note the orientation of the wires in terms of which goes on top of which, etc. Remove the T30 that holds the cage to the blower motor housing. Very carefully, ensuring not to crack the windshield, remove the two 13mm headed bolts that hold the cage to the firewall in the center top area. Gently unclip the ribbon connector from the styrofoam piece that sits on the right side of the steering column. Remove the 10mm headed plastic screw. It also has a Torx on it, but I use the hex side, from the top side of the styrofoam piece. There is another black plastic screw on the bottom back side holding the styrofoam to the cage, shown here from looking underneath. It looks like the back side is intended to be pressed through the hole in the cage, but I laid on my back and used pliers to turn it out from the foam. Note, for reinstallation, you will remove the screw from the cage and screw it into the foam so that then the foam piece, when it's reinstalled, the head of the screw will simply press into the cage. Release the ribbon cable from the holder on the air ducting. Unclip the air ducting from the attachment point on the cage here, just as you did with the other side that was attached at the blower motor. Unclip the ducting at the other end. And remove the ducting. Next, unclip the wiring loom from the steering column. There's one black clip on the top right and two white Christmas tree connectors on the underside going down the steering column. Unclip the wiring from the top side of the cage beside where the styrofoam was screwed in on the top. Next, get something to use to set on the floor with which to support the steering column. If it's allowed to drop to the floor, it could pull the boot out of the firewall. I used an empty container that I had handy. Starting with the back two, and there are four in total, to allow more control upon removal, remove the E10 headed bolts holding the steering column in place. Then, supporting the steering column with one hand, remove the front two bolts. And gently set the steering column on the support. Carefully, ensuring not to hit the windshield, remove the four 13mm headed bolts. They also have a Torx, but I use the hex, that hold the cage to the firewall by the steering column. Remove the two 13mm headed nuts that hold the cage to the firewall on the leftmost side. Remove the T30 screw that holds the cage to the heater AC housing, located here. Unclip the wire from the bracket that sits on the tunnel at the lower front of the heater AC box. Remove the ducting that sits below the bracket. For reinstallation, take note of how the various wires are sitting. Based on my experience of reinstalling this bracket, next time I will use a Sharpie to mark around where the bolts are on both sides before removal to facilitate getting the bracket in the correct position at reinstallation. So I'd suggest to do so at this point. Once marked with a Sharpie, then remove the very unusual looking bolt on the left side of the bracket. Unclip the wire harness from the right side of the bracket. With the bolt location on the right side of the bracket marked with a Sharpie, remove the bolt. And then remove the bracket. Next, disconnect the gray connector that attaches to the bottom of the fuse box. Being careful not to lift too much so as not to hit the windshield, gently lift up a little bit because the cage sits down in a centimeter or two, and then pull the cage toward you, swinging it out on the passenger side. There's still a wiring loom attached, and so you leave it just out of the way on the tunnel and passenger seat. I've placed some bags that I have for groceries in the back of the trunk on the passenger seat to prevent the bracket from damaging the seat. Next, disconnect the connector at the bottom of the blower motor. As shown here, depress both ends and the connector easily pulls out. Then gently remove the heater AC housing and set aside to begin removal of the evaporator and heater core. Remember, if you didn't have access to compressed air to blow it out, you're at risk of dribbling coolant onto the carpet. So you're going to have to take measures to prevent that from happening. And this is what the interior of the car looks like with everything removed. With the cage out, now is a good time to access the black plastic screw that goes into the foam by the steering column. I used needle nose pliers to pinch the ears, holding it into the cage, and then pressed it out. Then I installed it in its location in the styrofoam so that upon installation I can just press it through the hole in the cage. Now it's time to remove the evaporator. Take note of how the seal sits on the end of the unit. Then gently pull off the seal and set it aside. There are 15 screws, all of them the same size, that hold the evaporator cover of the housing to the rest of the housing. The screws are all on the vertical axis, so you can now remove them. Three of the screws are under the foam seal. I cut the middle part of the seal to access that screw. The two outside ones can be accessed by gently pulling the foam out of the way. I typically don't use power tools for removal of screws, etc., but one absolutely does not want to use a power tool to remove these screws because the glue side of the felt will wind around and rip the felt right off of the unit. Even with my hand tool, the felt was getting stuck. Now you can lift off the evaporator cover enough to remove the evaporator. But there is still one part of the housing attached to the lines that needs to be removed. Use a trim removal tool to gently pry away the two tabs and remove the plastic piece. Here is the offending evaporator. You can see it has been leaking for a very long time. I wanted to minimize my risk of having to go in and do all this again, so I decided while I was at it that I would replace the heater core too. So if you're also so inclined, next we can remove the heater core. Position the heater AC box so that you are looking at its left side. There are two solenoids that need to be removed. Remove the two screws from the frontmost solenoid and gently pull off the solenoid. You can observe that the solenoid fits over a tang and the sprocket can only sit on the gear in one position, so that makes correct assembly easy. Next, remove the other solenoid. We have removed the solenoids to gain access to this greenish uh, lever, which is blocking removal of the heater core. Gently rotate the gear so that the lever moves up so that it is out of the way. The heater core is held on by two screws and one clip at the bottom. Remove the screws and use your finger to unseat the clip. Then pull out the heater core. Now with your new parts ready to go, it's time to install the new heater core. Remove the clips holding the pipes to the heater core. Lift up on the tab on the clip and slide it off. There is a plastic bracket attached to the heater core, so release the tab and lift up on the hold down. Remove the pipes from the heat exchanger. The plastic piece needs to be transferred from the old heater core to the new one, so release the tab, then open the tab so that the bracket can be removed. Comparing the old and new heater cores, the fitment is the same, but the original was thicker in the fin area. The new heater core came with new O-rings, so install the plastic bracket onto the new heater core. Lubricate the O-rings with coolant mix and install them into the heater core. Install the pipes into the heater core. Reinstall the clips and depress the plastic retaining tab on the plastic bracket. The new heater core comes with adhesive-backed foam. Use the old heater core as a guide to install the foam. And your new heater core is now ready for installation into the heater AC housing. Using light air pressure, I blew out the housing. Then I inserted the heater core into the housing. Next, install the plastic bracket. Clip in the bracket at the bottom and install the two T20 screws. Gently lower the green arm into position. And install the solenoids. Recall that they only fit one way, and there are two T20 screws on each. Next, I gently blew out the chamber where the evaporator gets installed. Note that the evaporator comes with new O-rings pre-installed. Install the new evaporator. Place the small plastic piece of the housing into position. Ensure that it is seated correctly in terms of the clips and bosses for the screws. Then install the T20 screws that hold the small plastic portion to the housing. Seat the evaporator cover correctly and note that there are various tangs as shown here. And here. And here. Install all 15 T20 screws. I lubricated the AC O-rings with PAG oil. Install the seal over the AC and coolant lines. And then I did a final gentle blowing off of the entire housing. Now we can start the process of reassembly. The heater core drain is just rubber, and so it will collapse fairly easily. So per one of the good videos that was available for this portion of the project by Milestone Motors on YouTube. Check that out if you want to see some video action of this. Uh, I placed a socket about 4 inches back from the drain, sort of half on the plastic part that you can see on the carpet and half on the carpet, but not on the connector that's being held down by the plastic. And the idea is this socket will hold up the housing to prevent it from collapsing the drain upon reinstallation. Lubricate where the AC and heater core lines run through the rubber grommet on the firewall so that they don't get stuck in the grommet. I used PAG oil for the AC lines and coolant for the heater core lines. Gently set the heater AC housing back in place. There's a lot of back and forth when doing this between the engine bay and the cabin to get the pipes through the grommets seated correctly. What you'll be doing next is gently setting the cage back in place, ensuring not to hit the windshield. I had to remove my socket at this stage to be able to set the cage down. I guess I used a socket that was too tall, so next time I'll use a shorter socket. But with the light, I was able to see that the drain seal was making a nice seal with the heater AC box, and it wasn't collapsed. Ensure that the cage is above the little tab on the heater core where the T30 gets installed. Resecure the wire harness to the heater AC box. The first time I did this, I didn't see that the wire was out of position until after the cage was installed, and I had to remove the cage to route the wire correctly. So attach this wire to the heater box at this stage. This image shows the incorrect routing of the wire harness. They need to go behind the brace for the cage, like so. Reinstall the 13mm bolts that hold the heater core to the cage in the top middle area. Ensure that the cage is positioned correctly and reinstall the two 13mm nuts on the leftmost side of the cage. Then do the same on the right side. At this point, the lines in the firewall should be fully seated and look like this. Install the T30 that holds the cage to the heater AC box next to the blower motor. And install the T30 by the steering column that holds the heater AC housing to the cage. Now that the heater core is supported and in its final position, do a visual inspection of the drain to ensure that it hasn't collapsed since the socket was removed, and inspect the lines at the firewall and grommet to ensure they are seated correctly. Reconnect the connector at the bottom of the blower motor. Retighten the bolts and screws that you've already installed on the cage to ensure that they are all tight. Install the 4 T30 13mm bolts on the cage at the steering column area, being careful not to contact the windshield. Reinstall the steering column, being careful not to contact the windshield. This involves installing 4 E10 headed bolts with washers. Place all of the wires correctly through and in front of the cage, and reinstall the wiring to the top of the cage beside where the styrofoam goes. Reconnect the black connector that has the white lever that attaches to the bottom of the fuse box. Reinstall the bracket on the tunnel at the front of the heater AC housing. Look back at your image of how the wires are running before disassembly and route them accordingly. Use the Sharpie marks you made as a guide for locating the bolts. If you didn't do this, you can look back at your before images to get a sense of the height of the bracket relative to the bolts on both sides and set accordingly when tightening. As shown here, my before pic for reference wasn't particularly helpful. There is a tang on the top of the bracket that the dashboard slides into, and there is a height and angle adjustability in the bracket. So I set it so the tang was approximately level with the car, and when installing the dashboard, this bracket will likely need to be adjusted for proper fit. Now reinstall the right side bolt per the height it was originally, and then reinstall the left side bolt at the height it was originally. Clip the wiring loom into the tang on the right side, and place the wiring loom on the left side over the end of the bolt. Then reinstall the center heater AC venting into the correct position. Install the AC vent on the left side. Install the ribbon wire into the clip on the left AC vent. Install the AC vent on the right side. Install the wiring harness on the steering column. Recall there are two white Christmas tree connectors and a black clip at the top. Install the foam piece by the steering column. Press the head of the screw on the back side into the hole in the cage, and then install the 10mm headed plastic screw on the top side. Install the ribbon wire for the ignition switch into the tabs on the foam. Check the routing of all of the wiring against the pictures taken during removal to ensure that everything is routed correctly. The following 8 images were taken before removing the cage. Moving to the engine bay, install the T30 bolt that holds the heater AC housing to the firewall on the engine side. You want to push it all the way in and then tighten with your ratchet. This is a fairly tight area, so a micro ratchet with a low profile Torx bit worked best on this bolt for me. You can see here the limited amount of space with which you are working. Then install the plastic covering for this bolt to the firewall. Install the 13mm headed bolt through the firewall from the engine compartment. Push it all the way in and then tighten with your ratchet. Reinstall the coolant hoses. The clip for this hand coupling would be very easy to drop when reinstalling onto the coupling, so be careful not to drop it. Reinstall the half moon bracket. Before installing the expansion valve, lubricate the O-rings that came new on the new evaporator with PAG oil. Replace the O-rings on the engine bay AC lines that go into the expansion valve. I bought a generic kit with my evaporator and heater core, which incidentally I purchased from rockauto.com, and then was able to compare the original O-rings to the various ones in the kit to find the correct size. Reinstall the expansion valve with the two T30 headed bolts holding on the expansion valve to the half moon bracket. Reinstall the AC lines to the expansion valve with the two 6mm Allen headed bolts and washers. Of course, before doing this, you need to remove the zip tie holding the AC line to the strut brace. Put the AC line back in the clip on the firewall. I found it easiest to spin the clip 180 degrees to see how to pull the tangs out on both sides, and then open the clip as shown here. Spin the clip back 180 degrees and install the line into the clip. Install the AC lines into the expansion valve and secure them with 6mm Allen-headed bolts. Before reinstalling the dash, etc., one can test for leaks using a vacuum pump and a AC manifold gauge set to test for pressure drop at rest. So to do that, you connect an AC manifold gauge set to the high and low side ports, ensuring that they're tight enough to open the lines but not too tight so as to damage the Schrader valves. And then you connect the yellow line from the AC manifold gauge set to the vacuum pump. Fill the vacuum pump with the appropriate level of the correct oil, turn on the vacuum pump, open the high and low side valves at the Schrader valves, and then open the low and high side valves on the manifold gauge set and pull a vacuum on the system for an hour or so. Then close the high and low side valves on the manifold gauge set and then shut off the vacuum pump. It's very important to do these latter two steps in that order. Then you let it sit for 45 minutes to an hour to test for leaks in the system. Of course, if you don't happen to have these tools and you don't want to invest in them just for this job, then you can take your chances and reinstall everything and hope that there are no leaks when you take it to get it charged. I happen to have these things, so I did the testing. So if you've confirmed that there are no leaks, or if you're just going to go for it and hope for the best, then you can now begin with dashboard reinstallation. Set the dashboard in place, and this takes a gentle touch with some getting in and out of the car to see the dash properly on both sides and in the middle. My adjustment for the bracket on the tunnel was a little too low, so I loosened the bolts on both sides of that bracket, let the bracket adjust to where it naturally wanted to sit vis-a-vis the dash, and then retightened. Next, check all of the screw points to ensure that the dash is seated correctly. Also note that, when seated correctly, the sides of the dash line up nicely with the spot welded door opening flange. Next, pull all of the wires into position. Don't forget to feed through the solar sensor to the top of the dashboard, and route the wire that goes in the middle of the dashboard for the hazard lights, door locks, climate control button, the top side of the opening where the radio goes, and reattach the Christmas tree connector to the dashboard. Connect the passenger side airbag. The black goes on the right side of the car and the green goes on the left side of the car, which can be a little confusing because you're looking up at it from underneath, so it looks backwards, so make sure you keep that straight. Next, install the 10mm bolt in the rightmost vent hole. Install the T20 screw in the middle back of the dashboard. Reconnect the solar sensor and install it. Reinstall the plastic piece for the defroster vent with 4 T20 screws. Reinstall the plastic defroster vent cover. Reinstall the 5 T20 screws with washers into the dashboard. Recall that the short ones go on the lower left, the short also on the left of the steering column. The two long screws go in the center area, and one short one goes on the right side just above and left of the cup holder. Then go over these 5 screws again, uh, plus the one you installed earlier to do a final tightening. Reinstall both A-pillar trims. Recall that you set them above the tab and then you slide them down, and then once they're down over the tab, then you press them in. And also take note in this image that there are holes in the dashboard itself where the tangs on the bottom of the trim slide into. Also note how the bracket in the middle slides down onto the pin on the door. So you need to start it above the pin, press in the middle gently so that the bracket will engage the pin when you then slide the trim piece down and into the 2 openings on the dashboard. Ensure that the trim piece is mated correctly on the bottom side as shown here. Reinstall the T20 screw with bracket. Reinstall the plastic cover, and then reinstall the door weather strip. And of course, we've done all this on both sides. Reconnect the connector on the light switch and reinstall the switch. Reconnect the small piece of trim vent to the left of the steering column. Place the wiring in the clip on the back of the gauge cluster. Reconnect the connector and reinstall the gauge cluster with 2 T10 screws. Reinstall the stock section, ensuring not to turn the clock spring using 4 T25 screws. Reconnect the 2 connectors on the lower back side of the stock section. Reconnect the connector for the heated steering wheel and then reinstall the bottom half of the steering column trim. Reinstall the plastic piece to the fabric that's attached to the steering column. Install the top half of the steering column trim. Reinstall the plastic radio climate control holder. Start by setting the plastic bracket in place. Route the wires for the climate control and radio units accordingly. Reinstall the 2 8mm headed bolts on the inside that go through the air ducts and into the steel bracket that the dashboard clips into. Then reinstall the 4 T20 screws. Next, install the key fob unit. Start by gently attaching the ribbon cable for the key fob unit. Then insert the key fob unit into the dash. Install the 2 Phillips screws and install the trim cover. Now it's time to install the steering wheel. First, line up the mark on the wheel with the mark on the steering column. Then install the 16mm headed bolt that holds on the steering wheel. Place the wire for the blue connector into the clip on the steering wheel. Reconnect the blue connectors. Reconnect the black and gray connectors in the steering wheel. Reconnect the green and black airbag connectors and reinstall the airbag. To install the radio, start by reconnecting the antenna, then reconnect the big connector, put the radio in place, and install the 2 Phillips screws. Then install the climate control unit by reconnecting the black and white connectors and gently pressing the unit back into place. Now it's time to install the long dash trim piece. Start by placing the trim piece in a position that will allow you to connect the wires. Working from the underside, reconnect the 2 connectors for the hazard light switch, door lock, and DTC buttons. Install the larger one first because it sits on top, then the smaller one. I used needle nose pliers to press the larger upper connector into the female. Then install the lower connector. Working from the top side, reconnect the ribbon connector for the start button. Then gently press the trim piece into place. Next, install the glove box and start by reconnecting the connector for the glove box light. Then reconnect the connector for the glove box trunk valet switch and install the wiring into the hold downs on the back of the glove box. Install the 2 T20 screws with washers on the sides of the glove box. Do not mix up the holes on the bottom for the under tray for the holes on the sides for the glove box. Note that all screws for the glove box are accessed through the opened glove box. Install the 4 T20 screws with washers on the top of the glove box opening. Now you can install the cup holders. Install the 2 Phillips screws with washer per cup holder. And then install the trim for the cup holders. Install the left side lower footwell panel. Start by reconnecting the connector for the trunk button. Then insert the end by the door sill trim and press the panel into place. Install the short Phillips screw and then install the hood release lever with the long Phillips screw. Install the driver's side panel that sits under the dashboard. Start by reconnecting the speaker connector. Then reconnect the footwell light connector. Place the antenna unit into the panel. Install the wire in the hold down clip on the panel and reconnect the black connector to the left side. Then install the 3 T20 screws with washers. Install the right side lower footwell panel. Start by tucking it under the door sill trim and press it into place. Note that in this particular image, it still needed an additional tap with my hand to get it fully seated. Next, install the panel that sits under the glove box. Start by reconnecting the wire for the auxiliary power outlet, then reconnect the wire for the footwell light. And install the 2 T20 screws with washers on the bottom. Now it's time to install the center console. Start by looking at pictures taken before removal to ensure that the wires are all run correctly. The 6 images that follow are for reference purposes. Install the front seat belts into their receivers to prevent the receivers from being caught under the console. I forgot to do this, and it absolutely 100% happened. Pull the emergency brake up as high as it will go, and it's easier to clear the emergency brake with the black connector holder removed. so do so before installing the console. With the back end of the center console elevated, slide the unit into place. Feed the emergency brake trim up through the console. Check that all the wires are routed correctly and ensure that the tangs on the front of the console are tucked into the dashboard on both sides. Feed the air ducts at the front into the console. They may put up a little resistance, so use your fingers to help them slide into the console. Reinstall the black connector holder to the console and place the two wires in the black connector. Route the two wires into the relief holders on the left and right sides of the console. Connect the connector that sits on the lower left side of the console and reinstall it into its clip on the side. Connect the connector on the left side and connect the connector on the bottom right. Place the two connectors into their clip on the console. Reconnect the connector between the ducting. First slide it out of its holder to connect the wires and then place it back into the holder. Clip the piece that was not disconnected in terms of its wiring back into its location in the housing. And reattach the rear covering onto the center console. Unclip the seat belts. Reinstall the two 10mm headed bolts by the gear shift lever. Reinstall the two plastic trim pieces that cover the bolts. Reinstall the trim at the emergency brake. Then install the trim for the center console. First, ensure that the wiring is routed appropriately. Lift the lid on the center storage compartment. Insert the trim at the front first and then work backward. Place the car back into park by pressing on the red clip and moving the gear selector all the way forward. Reinstall the gear shift levers around. First, reconnect the connector for the gear indicator. Then reconnect the connector on the right side and press the unit into place. I left the AC system under vacuum while I reassembled the car. It held vacuum without change over 6 hours, so I was confident that there were no leaks in the system. If you're not going to recharge the system yourself or not at this time, remove the vacuum pump and manifold gauge set from the high and low ports and reinstall the caps onto the Schrader valves. At this time, you can install the cowl and microfilter housing, etc. Reconnect the car battery, put the seats back into their normal position, and install the gear shift lever. I, in my case, needed to wait until I had the battery connected to be able to install the gear shift lever. But you do so as follows. And I don't have images of this, but this is the procedure. Put the car in accessory mode by not depressing the brake when pressing the start button twice so that the car doesn't start. Hold down the release button and press it into position. Put your foot on the brake and move the selector to drive. Then push down again on the gear shift lever to fully seat it. Then return it to the park position. Before starting the car, top up the coolant mix at the coolant reservoir and bleed the cooling system as follows. Remove the bleed screw on the coolant reservoir. Pour in your coolant mix to the appropriate level, and then reinstall the bleed screw. The Bentley manual says to reinstall the coolant expansion tank lid, but I've read elsewhere to leave it off. It makes sense to me to leave it off so that the air has somewhere to go, and so you can top up during the procedure if obviously too little coolant is in the system. So plug in the battery tender in the engine compartment to ensure that the battery voltage doesn't drop and interrupt the bleeding procedure. Put the car into accessory mode on position by turning the key without depressing any pedals. Turn the heater to max and the fan at the lowest speed. and turn the air conditioning off if it isn't already. Press the gas pedal all the way down for 10 seconds to initiate coolant bleeding procedure. It takes about 12 minutes, and you'll hear the electric water pump engage. You'll be able to see the pump squirting air and water into the coolant reservoir as shown in this image. Add coolant during the process as necessary and keep track of how much you put in so as not to overfill. Start the car and let it idle for 10 minutes. Reinstall the coolant cap after a few minutes. Watch the engine and coolant temperatures. Um, ensure that there aren't any fluctuations. And check for coolant leaks at the firewall. Now it's time to get the AC recharged, either by doing it yourself or taking your car to a shop for AC charging. The amount of refrigerant is specified on a sticker under the hood. On my car, that was 20.8 ounces. Recall that I had pulled the vacuum on the system earlier. Nevertheless, I pulled the vacuum for another hour and checked to ensure that it held vacuum for 30 minutes. I happen to have 2 cans of R134A from years ago, so I decided to do the charge myself. I used a kitchen size scale to weigh my can tapper and can so that I could determine the approximate amount of refrigerant I put in. Knowing that there is 12 ounces of refrigerant in the can and that the can with tapper weighed 23.72 ounces, I could open and close the low side valve on my AC manifold gauge set and reweigh the can with tapper to determine how much refrigerant had entered the system. If I put the whole 12 ounces in from the first can, then I'd need to get 8.9 ounces in from the second can. That would mean that the second can would weigh 14.83 ounces when the system is charged with 20.9 ounces. So I put about 19.5 to 20 ounces in because it's better for the system to be under than overcharged. Then I put a thermometer in the dash vent and watched the temperature go to about 45 Fahrenheit, which seemed good to me. So I decided to monitor how the AC works, and if I feel it's not working correctly, then I'll take it to a shop and have it evacuated and recharged professionally. So in summary, now this is a fairly involved job, but I think it's also very doable with these instructions, and a good opportunity to save money and learn more about how your car operates. So if you're inclined to take this on yourself, I hope that you find this video helpful. Best of luck.